This presentation is on budgeting and managing fiscal resources. Budgeting is the process of planning and controlling future operations by comparing actual results with planned expectations. A budget is a quantitative statement or detailed plan with the expectations of a defined area over a specified period of time. They provide a foundation for managing and evaluating financial performance. Budgets detail how resources like money, people, and time will be acquired and used to support planned services within the defined time period. Budgeting is a process of planning and controlling future operations by comparing actual results with planned expectations. It involves establishing goals and objectives for both nursing and the organization. Goals and objectives help identify the organization's priorities and direct the organization's efforts. To plan, the organization must know a lot of things, and they can look at the past to project the future. It's important to know the demographics of the population served, the influence of the community, any local competitors, all the sources of revenue, any important statistical data, and changes in market, like wage increases or price increases. You should also know equipment cost, their staff mix, like how many RNs, LPNs, or unlicensed assistant personnel, any regulatory changes, or organizational changes. There are a variety of different budgets, including an operating budget, which typically deals with revenue and expenses, a salary budget, which looks at salaries for personnel, capital budget, and then supply and non-salary expense budget. The operating budget is also called the annual budget. It is the organization's statement of anticipated expenses and revenues for the coming fiscal year. And a fiscal year either can be a calendar year at your organization, or it can be typically July 1st through June 30th of the following year. And oftentimes fiscal years are broken up into 4 quarters. So the revenue budget includes patient care income, and the expense budget includes both salary and non-salary items. And when you think of the expense budget, you typically think about cost centers, which nursing units are typically considered cost centers. And cost centers are basically the smallest area of activity within an organization for which costs are accumulated. Cost centers can produce revenue, like a lab or a cardiology unit, or they can be non-revenue producing, like the administrative office, for instance. There are also different ways to look at costs. Fixed costs are costs that will remain the same for the budget period, regardless of what's going on in the organization, such as insurance premiums or if you're paying rent for a space. Variable costs do change in direct proportion to patient volume, patient acuity, and supplies that you're using. So if more patients are admitted to a nursing unit, you're using more supplies, so your supply cost is going to be higher. Costs can either be direct or indirect. An example of direct costs are salaries for nursing personnel. They're costs that directly affect patient care. So nurses provide hands-on patient care, so those are considered direct costs. An indirect cost is a cost that's necessary, but it doesn't affect patient care directly. So the housekeeper that cleans the patient's room isn't taking care of the patient directly, but it's a necessary cost. Just like security in the building would be considered an indirect cost. Personnel budget or salary budget anticipates the cost paid within the cost center for salaries during the budgeted time. So it's not simply just the hourly rate that the employee gets. You also have to consider the amount of money that you're spending on benefits, shift differentials that a staff person might accumulate, any overtime hours, or if somebody is paid for on-call hours or gets premium time or callback time. You also have to look at merit increases. So if you're anticipating merit increases during that fiscal year, which is common, you would have to account for that in your budget. Now, when we're discussing the personnel budget, it's very important for nurse managers to understand some metrics associated with personnel. In an article that I used for this project, James Russell, who's a nurse, but he also has an MBA, wrote an article about the metrics that nurse managers should really be familiar with. So it's important for managers to get a handle on the numbers, understand how data work, and that's extremely helpful because managers are held accountable for budgetary expenses. So understanding basic principles can certainly help. And metrics that he talks about understanding are FTEs, which are full-time equivalents, productivity for nursing units, hours per patient day, and departmental budget calculations. So FTEs include non-productive time. So any benefited hours such as vacations, sick time, holidays, paid education, if an employee is having orientation, those are all non-productive hours, but they are included in the budget, should be included in the budget. Looking at the average daily census, or ADC, is used to calculate staffing needs on a unit, which is important for budgeting purposes. He also explains hours per patient day and how that's different from salary per patient day. So it's important for nurse managers to network with other nurse managers or nurse leaders, attend conferences, read articles, and become familiar with the jargon that's typically used. So being flexible and balancing the requirements for safe, quality care while being fiscally responsible with the hospital's money can take a lot of trial and error to achieve competence. So obviously not something that happens overnight. The supply and non-salary budget are the expenses for patient supplies needed on the nursing unit. So that includes such things as office supplies, equipment, service contracts. So if there's a fax machine or photocopier on the unit and you need a service contract for that piece of equipment, that is all figured into the supply and non-salary budget on a unit. And it's the nurse manager's responsibility to monitor the budget on the nursing unit. A variance is a difference between the budgeted cost and the actual cost. And there's something called variance analysis because it's unlikely that all of the projected budget items will actually be on target, but it's the manager's responsibility to speak to those variances, and they should be able to do it in a timely fashion. So in order to assess the variances that occur with the budget, the manager needs to identify items that are either over or under budget and find out why those variants occurred. So if it's something that happened a single time, that may not be as big of a deal as something that was ongoing. And managers should keep notes on what they've learned during that year and the items that they budgeted for to help prepare them for the next year's budget. Because remember, you use the past to help predict the future. It's also good to look at the payroll and look to see how much agency or supplemental staff personnel you're using, because that definitely affects the the budget because those employees would those staff members would get paid more than a typical unit staff member. If there's a lot of overtime use, it's good to keep track of why that was happening. So in looking at salary variances, you can have volume variances, which occur when there's a difference in the budgeted and actual workload requirements, as would occur with increases in patient days, or efficiency variances, which can happen if there's a difference between the budgeted and actual nursing care hours provided. Rate variances, also known as price or spending variances, reflect the difference in budgeted and actual hourly rates paid. Examples of non-salary expenditure variances could occur if there are changes in patient volume, patient mix, like your case mix index, supply quantity, or prices paid. Or if you start using new supplies that are really expensive, say the surgeons want to use new dressings that are 10 times more than the dressing that you're using now, you could anticipate an expenditure variance for those dressings. There are different reasons why you can have problems relating to the budget, like reimbursement. For instance, if an insurance company disputes charges for a patient that was on your unit and you're not getting reimbursed for those expenses, or if a patient disputes charges and refuses to pay. And then staffing can have an impact on the budget. Like I mentioned, if you're using a lot of float pool or PRN staff or agency staff members, you're probably going to have some variances in your budget. So what do nurse managers need to know? So I already talked about the metrics that are important for nurse managers to know, but they really need to be on top of financial planning for their department. They need to be aware of monthly revenue and expense reports, any deviations from the budget, and they should be able to communicate fiscal responsibility to the team. So it's important for staff members to know, how is the unit doing with maintaining the budget? Are they over expenses, or is there a deviation or a variance in salaries because there's a lot of overtime? They should also plan for capital expenses. So any big ticket items, expensive items that the unit needs, the nurse manager should anticipate when that equipment is going to need to be replaced and try to work that into their budget, because just because it's on a wish list, it may not actually be purchased that fiscal year. So that's something to consider. And they should be able to modify the budget for increasing or decreasing expenses. And they should also be able to prepare and present the budget to administration and be able to speak to their numbers. So I also looked at two different articles that talked about nursing leadership. So nursing and unlicensed supportive personnel comprise the largest portion of the workforce at any hospital. Therefore, nursing leadership has an important role in helping the organization achieve goals. However, nurses at all levels in the organization should have financial literacy to enhance growth for the individual and success for the organization. So nursing leaders must make it their responsibility to provide nurses with increased exposure to quality, safety, and financial data, thereby allowing nurses to translate data while achieving and sustaining successful outcomes. So programs like Budget Boot Camp, which gives basic budget concepts, components, and terminology for nurses so that they can make sense of that jargon, are being used to help make nurses more aware. And if you'd like to learn more about budgeting, you can watch this video. Thank you for listening.